The diamond on Sandra's finger was small, humiliatingly small, according to the whispers echoing through the marbled halls of the Gable estate. For 3 years, Leo Gable believed he was the savior of a girl with nothing but a library card and a heart of gold. He had shielded her from his mother's sharp tongue and his friends' elitist jokes, never realizing that the penniless waitress he intended to marry was the only person in the room who actually owned the ground they stood on. Tonight, the facade doesn't just crack, it explodes. When the most powerful man in the global tech industry walks through those double doors, he isn't looking for a business partner. He's looking for his daughter. The humidity of the midsummer evening hung heavy over the north shore of Long Island. But inside the Gable Manor, the air conditioning was set to a crisp, unforgiving chill. Leo Gable adjusted his silk tie in the mirror of the grand foyer, his reflection staring back with a mixture of pride and mounting anxiety. Tonight was the engagement gala, a formal announcement of his intent to marry Sandra Jenkins. To the Gable family, the name Jenkins sounded like a dull thud. It carried no weight, no history, and certainly no capital. Leo's mother, Beatrice Gable, had spent the last fortnight making sure everyone knew that her son was marrying for love, a phrase she uttered with the same tone one might use to describe a terminal illness. "She's late, Leo," Beatrice remarked, gliding into the foyer. Her neck was draped in a vintage Bulgari necklace that cost more than the suburban house Sandra lived in. A woman in her position should at least have the grace of punctuality. It's the only currency she has, after all. "She's coming straight from the clinic, Mother," Leo said, his voice tight. "She's a nurse. People depend on her." "People depend on waitresses and janitors too, darling. That doesn't mean we invite them to the gala," Beatrice sighed, waving a manicured hand. "Just ensure she's wearing the dress I sent. The grey one. It's modest enough to hide her lack of pedigree." Leo ignored the jab. He loved Sandra precisely because she wasn't like the women in his circle. She didn't care about the Gables' shipping empire or the social registry. When they had met 3 years ago at a rainy bus stop, she had shared her umbrella with him, unaware that he was the heir to a fortune. She was ordinary Sandra, the girl who thrifted her sweaters and worked double shifts to pay off her student loans. Or so he thought. At 8 p.m., a modest ride-share vehicle pulled up to the fountain. Sandra stepped out, but she wasn't wearing the grey dress Beatrice had chosen. Instead, she wore a simple, sleeveless navy gown that fit her perfectly. She looked elegant, but to the predatory eyes of the Long Island elite waiting inside, she looked budget. "You look beautiful," Leo whispered, meeting her at the door. He took her hand, noticing it was trembling slightly. "Leo, I don't think I can do this," Sandra whispered back. Her eyes, usually a calm, steady blue, were darting toward the fleet of Ferraris and Bentleys lining the driveway. "This isn't my world, you know that." "It's our world now," Leo insisted, kissing her knuckles. They entered the ballroom to a smattering of polite, icy applause. The room was a sea of black ties and couture gowns. Among the guests was Thomas Halloway, a rival of the Gables and a man known for his cruelty. He stepped forward, a glass of vintage scotch in hand. "So, this is the girl who captured the Gable heart?" Halloway smirked, looking Sandra up and down. "Tell me, Sandra, I hear you're from a small town in Ohio. My gardener is from Ohio. Perhaps you know him?" The circle of socialites erupted into stifled giggles. Sandra's face remained a mask of polite indifference. "I'm from Columbus, Mr. Halloway. It's a city of nearly 1 million people. I'm afraid I haven't met your gardener, though I'm sure he's more interesting than your conversation." The room went silent. Beatrice's glass nearly slipped from her hand. Leo felt a surge of pride, but also fear. Sandra was fighting back, and in this house that was a dangerous game. The evening progressed like a slow-motion car crash. Beatrice took every opportunity to point out Sandra's quaint background, mentioning how brave it was for her to wear synthetic lace among silk. But the atmosphere shifted when the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, unannounced. The security detail at the door didn't stop the newcomer. In fact, they stepped aside, their faces pale. A man stepped into the light. He was in his late 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than the Gables Manor's entire wine cellar. His presence was magnetic, the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Behind him stood 4 men in dark suits, not local security, but high-level private protection. Beatrice gasped. "Is that Franklin Vance?" "No," Leo whispered, his heart dropping into his stomach. "That's Franklin Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Global, the man who just bought the World Trade Center." The room froze. Franklin Sterling didn't attend parties. He didn't do galas. He was a ghost in the world of high finance, a king who ruled from the shadows of his private island. Franklin scanned the room with a predatory focus. His eyes skipped over Beatrice, ignored Thomas Halloway entirely, and landed squarely on the girl in the navy dress. "Sandra," the billionaire said, his voice booming through the silent hall. Sandra's grip on Leo's arm tightened until it hurt. She didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted. "Hello, Dad," she said quietly. The sound of Beatrice Gables' champagne glass finally shattering against the marble floor was the only sound in the room. Leo let go of Sandra's hand, looking at her as if she were a stranger. The ordinary girl was the heiress to the Sterling throne, and her father didn't look like he was here to give his blessing. The silence that followed Sandra's "Hello, Dad" was so absolute that the hum of the central cooling system sounded like a jet engine. Franklin Sterling didn't move. He stood at the edge of the sunken ballroom, his presence effectively sucking the oxygen out of the room. This wasn't just a wealthy man. This was a man whose conglomerate controlled the satellites that provided the Gables internet and the tankers that shipped their cargo. Beatrice Gable was the first to find her voice, though it was an octave higher than usual. "Dad?" "Sandra, dear, surely there's some mistake. You're a nurse from Columbus. We checked your background. Your father is a retired mailman named Arthur." Franklin Sterling stepped down the marble stairs, his leather shoes clicking with a rhythmic, predatory precision. "Arthur is my middle name, and I did work for the Postal Service 40 years ago, while I was putting myself through MIT. I find that when people look for a mailman, they stop looking for a billionaire." He stopped 3 feet from Leo Gable, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Franklin didn't even look at Leo. His eyes were locked on his daughter. 3 years, Sandra," Franklin said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating rumble. 3 years of living in a 5th-floor walk-up. 3 years of cleaning bedpans and eating ramen noodles while your trust fund accrued enough interest to buy this entire zip code. Are you finished with this little experiment in normalcy yet? Sandra stepped forward, her chin tilting upward. The shy, stuttering girl Leo had known for 3 years was evaporating, replaced by a woman with steel in her spine. "It wasn't an experiment, Dad. It was a life where people liked me for who I was, not for what my last name could buy them." "And how is that working out for you?" Franklin asked, finally casting a disparaging glance around the room. He looked at the modest navy dress Sandra wore. "I see you're still wearing off the rack. And these people," he looked at Beatrice, then at Thomas Halloway, who was sweating profusely. "These people have spent the last hour treating you like a charity project." Leo finally found his breath. "Mr. Sterling." "Franklin, I had no idea. Sandra, why didn't you tell me? I would have protected you from—" "Protected her?" Franklin interrupted, a cold, mirthless laugh escaping his throat. "Son, you couldn't even protect her from your own mother's insults. I've been sitting in my car for 20 minutes, watching the security feed. I heard what Mrs. Gables said about Sandra's synthetic lace. I heard Mr. Halloway compare my daughter to a gardener." Halloway turned a sickly shade of grey. "Sir, I was merely joking. A misunderstanding of the highest order." Franklin turned his head slowly toward Holloway. "I don't find it funny. In fact, I find it so unfunny that I think I'll call my board of directors. Sterling Global owns 40% of Holloway Logistics, doesn't it? I think it's time we liquidated our position. I hear the market is volatile tonight." "Wait, please," Holloway stammered, his glass slipping from his hand and joining Beatrice's in a pile of shards on the floor. "That would ruin me." "Then I suggest you find a new career," Franklin said dismissively. He turned back to Sandra. "Pack your things. The jet is at Teterboro. We're going to London for the weekend. There's a seat on the board waiting for you, and I'm tired of playing this game." Sandra looked at Leo. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but they weren't the tears of a victim. They were the tears of someone saying goodbye to a dream. "I loved you, Leo. I really did. I wanted us to just be us. But tonight showed me that even if I stayed ordinary Sandra, your family would never let us be happy. They don't want a partner for you. They want a trophy with a pedigree." "Sandra, no," Leo pleaded, reaching for her hand. "I don't care about the money. We can leave. We can go back to the apartment." "With what?" Beatrice shrieked, her panic finally manifesting as rage. "Leo, if you leave with this liar, I will cut you off. You won't have a cent." Franklin Sterling actually chuckled. It was a terrifying sound. "Mrs. Gable, your threat is adorable. My daughter's personal checking account, the one she hasn't touched in 3 years, could buy your husband's shipping company 3 times over. If Leo stays with her, he'll be the richest man in this room. But he won't be staying, because I'm taking her home." Sandra looked at the engagement ring on her finger. It was a half-carat diamond Leo had saved up for on a junior executive's salary. It was the most honest thing in the room. Slowly she twisted it off and placed it on a passing waiter's silver tray. "Keep it, Leo," she whispered. "Sell it and start your own firm. Get out from under your mother's thumb. Maybe then you'll be the man I thought you were." "Sandra!" Leo cried out as she turned towards the door. Franklin Sterling placed a heavy hand on Leo's chest, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't follow her. You're a Gable. You're small time. My daughter was born for thrones, not for ordinary lives, with boys who let their mothers pick their wives' dresses." As the Sterling security detail formed a phalanx around Sandra, the room watched in stunned silence. The girl they had mocked, the charity case they had sneered at, walked out of the manor with the grace of a queen returning to her kingdom. But as the doors closed, Sandra didn't look back. She didn't see Leo collapse into a chair, his head in his hands. She didn't see Beatrice frantically trying to call her husband to save their stocks. She only saw the dark tint of the limousine windows, reflecting a world she had tried to escape, and the father who was about to turn her life into a war zone. The transition from a cramped studio apartment in Queens to a penthouse overlooking Central Park was less of a move and more of a displacement. Within 48 hours, the scrubs Sandra had worn for 3 years were incinerated, per her father's orders, and replaced by a wardrobe of tailored wool, heavy silks, and heels that clicked like a death knell on marble floors. Franklin Whitmore sat at the head of a mahogany table that could seat 40 people. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was the chairman, and Sandra was no longer his runaway daughter. She was the chief of strategy for Whitmore Global. "The Holloway liquidation is nearly complete," Franklin said, sliding a tablet across the table. His voice was devoid of the paternal warmth he'd shown in the limo. "Thomas Holloway's stock in his own company is worth pennies. He's currently begging for a meeting. What do you want to do with him?" Sandra looked at the data. A week ago, this would have made her sick. Now, she felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. Let him wait. If he calls again, tell him we're only interested in his warehouse assets at a 90% discount. He insulted me in that ballroom, but he insulted the Whitmore name more. He needs to understand the price of that. Franklin nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "And the Gables?" Sandra paused. The memory of Leo Gables' face, the shock, the heartbreak, and the lack of a spine when his mother attacked her, still burned. Beatrice Gable thinks she's the queen of the North Shore. She spent years making sure I knew I was less than. I want her to realize that the only reason her family still has a shipping license is because I haven't revoked it yet. Leo is calling the office, Franklin noted, his eyes narrowing. 10 times a day. Block him, Sandra said, though her heart gave a traitorous thud. I'm not the girl from the bus stop anymore. That girl is dead. Beatrice Gable killed her. Underscore, 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 underscore. While Sandra was being forged into a weapon in Manhattan, the Gable household was in a state of absolute collapse. Beatrice Gable was pacing the length of her drawing room, her face gaunt. The news of Sandra's true identity had spread through the Long Island social circuit like a wildfire. The same people who had snickered at Sandra's synthetic lace were now refusing to take Beatrice's calls. "We're ruined, Leo!" Beatrice shrieked, throwing a social invitation onto the floor. "The Hamptons charity gala was cancelled. For us, they said our presence might cause a conflict of interest with the primary donor. That donor is Franklin Whitmore." Leo sat on the sofa, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. "You did this, Mother. You and your obsession with class. You had a billionaire's daughter in your house, and you treated her like a servant." "How was I to know?" she wailed. "She lived in a hovel. She worked for hourly wages." "She did it to find someone real," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "And she found me. But I wasn't real. I was just another Gable, wasn't I? I stood there while you insulted her. I let Holloway mock her." The doorbell rang. It wasn't a guest. It was a courier in a crisp black uniform. He handed Leo a legal envelope. Leo tore it open. His face went white. "It's a foreclosure notice on the shipping terminal. Whitmore Global bought the debt from the bank this morning. They're calling it in. We have 72 hours to pay $40 million, or they seize the fleet." Beatrice collapsed into a chair. $40 million? We don't have that in liquid. We'd have to sell the manor. We'd have to sell everything. "Then I guess we're selling," Leo said, a strange, hollow laugh escaping him. "Sandra isn't just leaving us. She's erasing us. Underscore, 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 underscore." Back at the Whitmore Global HQ, Sandra was staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows when her private line buzzed. It was Simon Reed, her father's head of security, a man who knew more secrets than the CIA. "Miss Whitmore," Simon said, his voice low, "you asked me to look into the coincidence of how you met Leo Gable 3 years ago." Sandra's breath hitched. "And?" "It wasn't a coincidence," Simon replied. "Your father didn't just find you at that engagement party. He knew where you were the entire time. In fact, he leaked your location to the Gables junior recruiter 3 years ago. He wanted you to meet Leo. He wanted you to see what ordinary people were really like, so you'd be disgusted enough to come home and take the throne." The room seemed to tilt. Sandra gripped the edge of her desk. "He set us up? He let me fall in love with a man just to prove a point?" "He didn't just set you up," Simon added. "He's been subsidizing the Gables' debt for years, keeping them afloat just so they'd be the perfect trap for your sentimentality. He knew Beatrice Gable would eventually show her true colors. He timed the foreclosure for the exact moment you took your seat on the board." The twist hit Sandra harder than any insult Beatrice had ever hurled. She had thought she was taking her power back, but she was still a pawn. Her father hadn't rescued her. He had orchestrated her heartbreak to build a CEO. Sandra looked at the phone, then at the door to her father's office. The ordinary girl was gone, but the billionaire heiress was starting to realize that in this world, the monsters didn't just live in manor houses, They sat at the head of your own table." "Simon," Sandra said, her voice turning to ice, "don't block Leo's next call. Transfer it directly to me. It's time I started playing a game of my own." The office of the chairman was a fortress of glass and cold ambition. Franklin Whitmore sat behind his desk, swirling a glass of 20-year-old Scotch, looking every bit the king of the world. When Sandra walked in, she didn't sit. She stood by the window, watching the tiny, ant-like cars on Park Avenue below. "The Gable foreclosure is proceeding," Franklin said, not looking up from his ledger. "By Friday, their shipping licenses will be ours. It's a clean sweep, Sandra. You've proven you have the stomach for the family business." Sandra turned, her expression unreadable. "You set me up, Dad. Simon told me everything. You didn't just find me at that party. You planted me in Leo's path 3 years ago like a piece of bait." Franklin set his glass down with a heavy thud. He didn't deny it. "I gave you a choice, Sandra. You wanted to live ordinarily. I simply chose the environment. I knew the Gables were shallow, debt-ridden social climbers. I knew they would eventually break your heart. I just accelerated the lesson. You used my life as a laboratory experiment." Sandra's voice didn't rise, but it vibrated with a dangerous energy. "I saved you from a mediocre life with a mediocre man," Franklin countered. "If Leo Gable actually loved you, he would have stood up to his mother that first night. He would have defended you against Holloway. He didn't. He's a coward, Sandra. I didn't make him a coward. I just gave him the stage to prove it." Sandra felt the sting of truth in his words, but the betrayal cut deeper. "You think you've won. You think I'm going to sit here and be your loyal soldier while you dismantle people's lives for sport. You're a Whitmore," Franklin said, finally looking her in the eye. "We don't play. We rule. Underscore, 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 underscore." That night, Sandra did something she hadn't done since the gala. She drove herself. No security, no driver. She took a nondescript rental car to a dive bar in a part of Queens, where the streetlights flickered and the air smelled of exhaust and fried food. Leo Gable was sitting in a corner booth, staring at a glass of cheap beer. He looked haggard. The polished air of the Gable fortune was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he'd been dragged through the gears of a machine. "You look terrible," Sandra said, sliding into the booth across from him. Leo jumped, his eyes wide. "Sandra, I've been calling. I thought you hated me." "I should," Sandra said. "My father orchestrated our meeting, Leo. He's been propping up your family's failing company for years, just so he could pull the rug out when it hurt the most. You were a pawn. I was a pawn." Leo let out a dry, hacking laugh. "My mother is currently drinking herself into a stupor because the bank took her jewelry today. My father is in D.C. trying to lobby for a bailout that isn't coming. We're losing everything, Sandra. And the worst part is, I don't even care about the money. I care that I let them talk to you like that. I care that I was too weak to walk out that door with you before your father showed up." Sandra reached across the table, her hand hovering over his before she pulled back. "My father thinks he's turned me into him. He thinks I'm ready to lead Whitmore Global into a new era of conquest. He's wrong." "What are you saying?" Leo asked. "I'm saying I'm going to help you," Sandra whispered, "but not because I've forgiven you. I'm helping you because I want to burn my father's empire to the ground. He wants a war. I'll give him one." Leo looked at her, seeing a fire in her eyes that wasn't there when she was ordinary Sandra. "How? He owns us. He owns the debt." "He owns the debt through a shell company called Apex Holdings," Sandra explained, sliding a flash drive across the table. "I found the digital trail. If you can prove that Apex was using insider information to manipulate your stock prices before calling in the debt, you can file for an emergency injunction. It won't save the Gables' reputation. But it will freeze my father's assets for months. It will create a scandal so big the board will have to remove him. Leo stared at the drive. You're betraying him. Your own father. He betrayed me the moment he decided my happiness was a secondary concern to his legacy, Sandra said. Take the data, Leo. Give it to the press. Give it to the SEC. But there's a condition. Anything, Leo said. You have to stand up. Really stand up this time. No more junior executive titles. No more asking Beatrice for permission. If we do this, you have to be the one to pull the trigger. I have to stay on the inside to make sure he doesn't see it coming. Leo gripped the flash drive. For the first time in weeks, the fog in his eyes cleared. He thinks he's the only one who knows how to play dirty. He's about to find out what happens when he pushes the two people who have nothing left to lose. Underscore, 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 underscore. As Sandra walked back to her car, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her father. Board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. We're announcing the Gable acquisition. Wear the Chanel suit. Look like a queen. Sandra deleted the message. She looked up at the smog-filled sky and smiled. The ordinary girl was gone. The billionaire heiress was a lie. What was left was something Franklin Whitmore hadn't accounted for. A woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a throne from the inside out. The war had officially begun, and the first casualty would be the man who thought he had already won. The boardroom of Whitmore Global was a cathedral of ego. 30 floors above Wall Street, the air smelled of expensive leather and the ozone of high-end servers. Franklin Whitmore sat at the head of the obsidian table, his fingers steepled. To his right sat Sandra, clad in a sharp, structured Chanel suit that felt like armor. The acquisition of Gables shipping is a formality, Franklin announced to the gathered board members, 12 of the most powerful people in the country. As of 9 a.m., we have seized their primary terminals. By noon, the Gable name will be a footnote in the history of American industry. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. These were people who viewed human lives as data points on a spreadsheet. However, Sandra said, her voice cutting through the chatter like a diamond through glass, there is a small matter of the Apex Holdings audit. I believe the board should see the full disclosure before we finalize the merger. Franklin's eyes narrowed. Sandra, that's an internal matter. It's been handled. It hasn't, she countered, standing up. She clicked a remote, and the massive LED screens on the wall flickered to life. Instead of the projected profit margins for the Gable takeover, a series of internal emails appeared. They were dated 2 years ago, long before Sandra had coincidentally met Leo. The emails were between Franklin and a private investigator. They detailed a plan to manipulate the Gables' credit rating, forcing them into a high-interest loan with Apex Holdings, a company Sandra had just proven was a front for her father's personal slush fund. This isn't just an acquisition, Sandra told the stunned board. This is market manipulation. This is a federal crime, and my father used my personal life as the cover for the final stage of the hostile takeover. The room erupted. In the midst of the chaos, the heavy doors at the back of the room swung open. Leo Gable walked in, flanked by 2 men in suits, not security, but agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. Franklin Whitmore, one of the agents said, holding up a badge. We have a warrant for the seizure of all Apex Holdings records. Mr. Leo Gable has provided us with the digital keys to your encrypted servers. Franklin didn't panic. He was a man who had stared down dictators and market crashes. He looked at Leo, then slowly turned his gaze to Sandra. You think this stops me? I have the best lawyers in the world. I'll be out of this by dinner. And you'll have nothing. Actually, Dad, Sandra said, leaning over the table, I've already spoken to the board's ethics committee. Given the nature of the scandal, they've invoked the morality clause in your contract. You're being removed as chairman, effective immediately. As the SEC agents escorted a stony-faced Franklin towards the private elevator, Leo and Sandra stood in the center of the storm. For a moment, it felt like the old days, just the two of them against the world. "You did it," Leo whispered. "You actually pulled the trigger." "I did," Sandra said. But her eyes weren't on him. They were on the empty chair at the head of the table. Underscore, 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 underscore. While the Titan was falling in Manhattan, the ruins of the Gable dynasty were being picked over in Long Island. Beatrice Gable was in her bedroom, frantically stuffing emeralds and pearls into a silk scarf. The power had been cut to the manor an hour ago. The silence was deafening. "I won't be poor," she hissed to the empty room. "I won't be one of those people." She heard a floorboard creak. She turned, expecting to see a repo agent. Instead, she saw Thomas Halloway. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His tie was loose, and his eyes were bloodshot. "They took it all, Beatrice," Halloway said, his voice a ragged whisper. "Sterling, Whitmore, whatever her name is. She wiped me out. I have nothing left but a suitcase and a grudge." "Get out, Thomas," Beatrice snapped. "I have enough problems without you haunting my house." "You don't understand," Halloway said, stepping into the moonlight. He held up a burner phone. "I have something, a recording from the night of the gala." I was wearing a wire. I always wear one during business deals. I caught Franklin talking to his security head about how he planted Sandra to ruin the Gables. But I also caught Sandra talking to Leo in the garden later that night, talking about how she knew her father was a crook, and she was going to play him to get the inheritance early. Beatrice froze. "What? She isn't a hero, Beatrice," Halloway smirked. "She's just a better predator than her father. She didn't save Leo. She used him to clear her path to the throne. If this goes public, the SEC won't just take Franklin. They'll take her too." Beatrice's eyes lit up with a familiar, poisonous spark. "Give me that phone, Thomas. If I'm going down, I'm taking that ordinary girl with me. Underscore, 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 underscore." Back in the city, Sandra sat in her father's chair. The board was in an emergency session in the next room, debating whether to name her the interim CEO. Leo was waiting for her in the lobby, thinking they were going to go grab a coffee and talk about them. But Sandra wasn't thinking about coffee. She was looking at a document on the desk, a transfer of power she had drafted weeks ago. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She swiped to answer. "Hello, Sandra." Beatrice Gables' voice crackled through the line, dripping with malice. "I hope you're enjoying that chair. You should get comfortable, because I'm about to send a very interesting audio file to the New York Post. It seems ordinary Sandra is quite the little actress. Tell me, how much is your new reputation worth to you?" Sandra closed her eyes. The twist was tightening. She had defeated the lion, but the snakes were still in the grass. "How much do you want, Beatrice?" Sandra asked, her voice cold. "I don't want money anymore, dear," Beatrice purred. "I want you to come back to the manor, alone, tonight. We're going to have a little chat about family values." The drive back to the North Shore was a journey through a graveyard of memories. Sandra steered the car towards the Gable Manor, the headlights cutting through a thick, rolling fog that had drifted in from the Atlantic. Every mile felt like a regression. The further she moved from the shimmering glass towers of Manhattan, the more she felt the weight of the girl she used to be, the girl who believed a small diamond and a promise of a suburban life were enough. The grand estate, once a symbol of unassailable prestige and the ultimate gatekeeper of Sandra's happiness, now looked like a crumbling relic. The massive wrought-iron gate stood slightly ajar, the motor humming with a dying whine. Only a few windows on the second floor were lit, casting jagged, uneven shadows across the overgrown lawn. The gardeners had clearly been the first to stop coming when the paychecks dried up. She stepped into the foyer, and the air hit her immediately. It smelled of dust, stagnant air, and the sharp, medicinal tang of expensive gin. The grand chandelier, which used to blaze with thousands of crystals, was dimmed to a ghostly amber. Beatrice Gable was waiting in the drawing room. She was sitting in a wingback chair, her silhouette framed by the dying embers in the fireplace. She looked like a disgraced queen in an empty palace, her silk robe stained and her hair uncharacteristically disheveled. Beside her, lurking in the shadows of the bookshelf, stood Thomas Halloway. His face was twisted into a mask of desperate triumph, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. "You came," Beatrice said, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't spoken to anyone but the shadows for days. "I suppose even a Whitmore has a survival instinct. Or perhaps you just couldn't resist seeing the mess you made." "Let's skip the theatrics, Beatrice," Sandra said, standing firmly in the center of the room. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't want to settle in. She wanted to remain a visitor in this house of ghosts. "You have a recording. You think it proves I'm as dirty as my father. You think it gives you a seat back at the table. What do you want?" Beatrice let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "What do I want? I want my life back!" she suddenly shrieked, slamming her crystal glass onto a side table with such force that it cracked. "I want the debt cleared. I want the Gable name restored to the registry. I want you to use your new authority to make the SEC investigation into our shipping licenses vanish. I want the world to forget I ever had to pack my own bags." "I can't do that, Beatrice," Sandra said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "The SEC is already in the servers. I can't stop a federal train once it's left the station. Even if I could, I wouldn't. Your family lived on credit and lies for a decade. My father just accelerated the inevitable." "Then you'll go down with us." Halloway stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He shook a burner phone at her like a talisman. "This recording, I've listened to it 100 times, Sandra. It shows you planned to play your father. It shows premeditation. It shows you were never a victim. You were an infiltrator, a corporate spy, using your own heart as a Trojan horse. The board will dump you before the ink on your CEO contract is dry. You'll be just another Whitmore in a jumpsuit." Sandra looked at Halloway, seeing the pathetic remains of a man who once thought he ruled the logistics world. Then she looked back at Beatrice, whose eyes were filled with a poisonous hope. A cold, slow smile spread across Sandra's face, a smile that looked terrifyingly like her father's. "You really think I'd come here without a plan?" Sandra asked. "You think I'm still that girl who cried in your ballroom because you insulted her dress? Beatrice, you taught me that in this world there is no such thing as a fair fight. There is only the person who is prepared and the person who is lunch." "You have no leverage here," Beatrice hissed, her fingers clawing at the velvet armrest. "We have the recording. We have the truth. Don't I?" Sandra reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device. "Beatrice, do you know what a live stream is? My security team is currently monitoring this entire conversation from a van parked 3 blocks away. Everything you've said for the last 10 minutes, the extortion, the demands to subvert a federal investigation, the admission of your own financial ruin, is currently being uploaded to a secure cloud server held by the district attorney's office." Halloway's face went a sickly shade of white. He looked at the burner phone in his hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a live grenade. "You're bluffing," he stammered. "You wouldn't risk your own reputation." "Try me," Sandra said. "I've already lost my privacy, my father, and the man I thought I loved. What else is there to take? But before you decide to hit send on that recording, there's one more thing you should know. About that audio file you're so proud of." The heavy oak doors of the drawing room, which had been shut tight, suddenly pushed open. Leo Gables stepped inside. He didn't look like the broken man Sandra had met in the dive bar. He didn't look like the junior executive who couldn't find his voice. He looked composed, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on his mother with a mixture of profound pity and absolute resolve. Leo! Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Thank God! Leo, tell this girl to stop. Tell her we have the upper hand. She's recording us, but we have her. We have the proof. We don't have anything, Mother, Leo said quietly. He walked across the rug, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped in front of Holloway, and without a word, snatched the burner phone from the older man's shaking hand. Holloway was too stunned, too defeated to resist. Leo, what are you doing? Beatrice whispered, her voice failing. I gave this to Thomas, Leo said, looking at Sandra. His voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The room went deathly silent. Sandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She looked at Leo, her heart hammering against her ribs, a new kind of dread pooling in her stomach. What did you say? Leo looked at Sandra, his expression unreadable. I knew Holloway was looking for dirt. I knew he was hiding in the bushes the night of the gala, trying to find a way to save his own skin. I gave him the recording he's been holding over you. But Sandra, it's not the recording he thinks it is. Leo turned the phone on, cranked the volume to the maximum, and pressed play. A voice filled the room, but it wasn't Sandra's. It wasn't a conversation about corporate takeovers or playing a billionaire father. It was Beatrice's voice, recorded months prior in the privacy of her study. She was talking to a contractor about skimming the maintenance funds from the Gables shipping fleet, the very skimming that had led to the ships being declared unsafe, which triggered the banks to call in the debt. It was the smoking gun that proved the Gables had systematically destroyed their own legacy long before Franklin Whitmore ever stepped foot in their foyer. You betrayed your own mother? Beatrice whispered, her face collapsing into a mask of wrinkles and horror. I saved the woman I love, Leo said, turning his full attention to Sandra. I knew they'd try to blackmail you. I knew they'd try to drag you down into the mud with them. I had to give them enough rope to hang themselves, Mother. I needed you to bring Sandra here, under the impression that you were in control, so she could hear you admit to your crimes on her own security feed. It was the only way to ensure you could never touch her again. Sandra was reeling. The world felt like it was spinning on a different axis. Leo, you played them? All of them? You used Holloway as a pawn to bait me here? I'm a Gables, Sandra, Leo said, a sad, hollow smile touching his lips. I learned from the best. I grew up watching my mother manipulate every social interaction and my father hide every loss. But I'm not my mother, and I'm certainly not your father. Holloway backed away, realizing the game was over. He bolted for the door, his pride finally shattered. But two of Sandra's security guards were already there, stepping out of the shadows of the hallway. They were followed by 3 plainclothes officers. Beatrice didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply sat back in her chair, looking at her son as if he were a stranger. As the officers approached to escort them into custody, the only sound was the clicking of handcuffs and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the North Shore cliffs. Underscore, 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 underscore. As the sirens faded into the distance and the flashing blue lights disappeared from the driveway, Sandra and Leo stood alone in the wreckage of the drawing room. The silence was different now. It wasn't heavy with secrets, but it was hollow. The fire had gone out, leaving only the smell of cold ash. You used me too, Sandra said, her voice trembling. She felt a sudden, sharp distance from him. You set this whole confrontation up. You put me in danger. You let me drive out here thinking I was being blackmailed, just to get that confession. I did what I had to do to clear your path, Leo said, stepping toward her, his hands reaching out before he caught himself. The Whitmore board can't touch you now. The press won't have a scandal to report, because the only criminals in this story are on their way to a holding cell, You're a hero, Sandra. You took down the corrupt Gables and the predatory Franklin Whitmore in one sweep." "But at what cost, Leo?" Sandra asked, tears finally spilling over. "Look at us. We're just like them. We're moving pieces on a board, calculating every move, recording every conversation. Where does the ordinary part start? When do we stop being CEOs and heirs and just be people?" Leo reached out again, his hand finally cupping her cheek. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the icy air of the manor. "Maybe we can't be ordinary, Sandra. Maybe we were never meant to be. But we can be honest. This was the last lie. I promise." Sandra looked into his eyes, searching for the boy she had met at the bus stop, the one who shared his umbrella and didn't know a thing about shipping lanes or stock options. He was still there, buried under layers of silk and scandal, but he was changed. They were both survivors of a war they hadn't asked for. "I have to lead the company, Leo," Sandra said, pulling away slightly, her voice regaining its professional steel. "I have to fix what my father broke. I have to turn Whitmore Global into something that helps people instead of crushing them. And that means I can't be with a Gable, not yet. Not while the world is waiting for me to fail." "I know," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to rebuild the shipping line. The right way. No skimming, no lies. I'll earn my way back to the person I was, and I'll earn my way back to you." Sandra turned to leave, her heels clicking on the marble foyer. She stopped at the front door, looking back at the dark, empty house that had once been a fortress of elitism. "Leo? Yeah? Don't become like them," she whispered. "Please." She walked out into the foggy night, the weight of $1 billion empire now firmly on her shoulders. She had her seat. She had her power. But as she drove away from the ruins of the North Shore, she realized that the highest seat in the world is also the loneliest, and the only way to stay ordinary was to never forget the sound of the rain. 6 months had passed since the night the Gable Manor fell into silence, and the world had not stopped turning. The glass tower of the former Whitmore Global headquarters now bore a new identity. The name Whitmore, once synonymous with predatory acquisitions and cold-blooded profit, had been stripped from the granite facade. In its place was a simple, elegant logo, SM, International. The S stood for Sandra, but the M no longer stood for the father who had tried to mold her into a monster. It stood for merit. Inside the executive suite, the atmosphere had shifted. The smell of ozone and tension had been replaced by the faint scent of fresh jasmine and the quiet hum of a team that worked out of respect rather than fear. Sandra sat at her obsidian desk, but the room felt different. She had replaced the intimidating leather chairs with soft, ergonomic seating, and the walls were no longer bare. They held sketches of the community clinics her foundation was now funding. She wasn't wearing the structured Chanel suits that felt like armor anymore. Today she wore a simple, well-tailored silk blouse in a soft, dusty blue, the exact color of the sky on the rainy afternoon 3 years ago, when she had first met Leo. Her assistant, a young woman Sandra had hired from a local community college, buzzed the intercom. "Miss Whitmore, a delivery just arrived. The courier insisted it be handed to you directly." A moment later, a man in a nondescript uniform walked in. He carried a small, weathered wooden box. It wasn't wrapped in expensive paper. It didn't have a designer ribbon. There was no card attached. Sandra's heart did a strange, familiar somersault in her chest. She thanked the courier and waited until the door clicked shut before she let her fingers touch the grain of the wood. She opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of humble navy velvet, was the small, half-carat diamond ring. It was the same ring she had left on a waiter's tray at the engagement gala, the ring Leo had bought with his own hard-earned savings. Beside it lay a small, handwritten note on a piece of simple, unlined paper. The handwriting was steady, devoid of the frantic energy of the man she had last seen in the ruins of the North Shore. "The fleet is back in the water. The workers have their pensions back, and the safety protocols are the best in the industry. The name Gable means something good again. It means integrity. I've spent every day of the last 6 months trying to be the man you thought I was when we had nothing. I'm ready if you are. L. Sandra looked out the floor-to-ceiling window. Down on the street, far below the executive suites and the power lunches, the city was caught in a sudden Manhattan downpour. She scanned the sidewalk near the park, and there he was. Leo Gable was standing by a bus stop, huddling under a fraying umbrella. He wasn't looking up at the tower, searching for a sign of her wealth or her power. He was just waiting, watching the buses pull up one by one, a man at peace with the rain. Sandra didn't call her driver. She didn't alert her security detail or check her schedule for the afternoon. She grabbed her trench coat, tucked the wooden box into her pocket, and walked towards the elevator. As the doors slid shut, she caught her reflection in the polished chrome. She didn't see an heiress, a CEO, or a billionaire's daughter. She saw a woman who had finally stopped running. She saw Sandra. And as the elevator descended towards the lobby, she realized that the most powerful thing she could be was perfectly, beautifully ordinary. The truth has a funny way of coming out, doesn't it? Sandra Whitmore learned that you can't build a future on a foundation of lies, no matter how much gold you use to cover the cracks. In the end, it wasn't the billionaire's throne that gave her power. It was the courage to walk away from it and find the truth in the rain. If you enjoyed this journey of high-stakes drama and the ultimate quest for authenticity, don't forget to like this video and comment below with your favorite twist. Do you think Leo and Sandra can truly start over, or is the past too heavy to carry? Share this story with someone who loves a good hidden heiress tale, and make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode of our storytelling series. Thanks for watching.